All right, Shabbos, say good morning. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Tzadik Gimel. Beginning by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yoel and Sarah Kelman, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in dedication to the Kehillah for providing all of these opportunities for Talmud Torah. The Daf Yomi sponsor for Refuah Shalema, for Dr. Aviva Weisbord, Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheina Chana. We dedicate our learning in the Zechus of Refuah Shalema for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tovi Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Kol Cholei Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. And both say with that, let us begin. So today's Daf Tzadik Gimel, we're up to Tzadik Beis. There's a lot to do today. So 92b, and we are picking up with Tzoa Biktana. So say this is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. So also remember again, we're dealing with the dramatic cases yesterday of the Chatzar Gedola, Chatzar Ketana. So what began as a discussion by Eruvin, right, where again I have a small Chatzar that is totally breached into a larger Chatzar. Also remember the image that ultimately again remember the smaller Chatzar is totally open on one side. The larger Chatzar has what we call the Gifufin, right? On the side that it opens up into the smaller Chatzar, Saloch Lamais, it has the side posts that are there. So essentially in this case, the larger Chatzar is still considered to be enclosed because those Gifufin, as long as you have an opening of less than 10 amas, so that is just called a doorway. So the larger Chatzar is considered to be enclosed, but the smaller Chatzar is fully breached on one side, which makes it totally open, of course, and really, really subsumed by the larger Chatzar. So we began in yesterday's daf. So this started as an Eruvin discussion, but then what the Gemara went ahead and did was really fascinatingly enough to show us a number of different examples of how the smaller Chatzar really becomes swallowed up by the larger one. So we saw the case of Eruvin, we saw the case of Klai HaKerem, we saw the case of Shliach Tzibor, and we saw the case of Minyan. So in all of these cases, halacha l'maisa, the smaller chatzar becomes totally secondary to the larger one. Another example, Soa Biktana, both say what happens if there's excrement in the small chatzar? Excrement in the small chatzar, and I'm standing in the large chatzar. So what's the halacha? Mutar likros Kriya Shema b'gdola. You're permitted to go ahead and recite Kriya Shema if you're standing in the large chatzar. We'll say, what's the logic? The logic is because, remember, by the large chatzar, when you stand in the large chatzar, it's ki'ilu what? You have a mechitza. You have a partition in front of you. So therefore, the tzoa is partitioned off from me. However, so tzoa b'ktana mutar likros Kriya Shema b'gdola. Amru Abaye. Imkain, if that's the case, matzinu mechitza le'isser. So both say now. Okay, so that ends the. I skipped. I'm sorry, I skipped the first line. It's tzoa b'gedola asar likros kriya shema b'ktana. If the excrement is in the larger chatzar and I'm standing in a smaller chatzar, I can't say kriya shema. Why not, Rabbi? Because that is as if I am standing in the same rishus as the excrement. Because Rabbi say, obviously, again, if I'm in the small one, the tzoa is in the large one. So therefore, halach l'maisa, the small one is pulled in, swallowed up by the larger one. Conversely, tzoa b'ktana mutar likros kriya shema b'gedola. But if the tzoa is in the smaller chatzar, and I am standing in the larger chatzar, then that's okay. I can say kriya shema. Why? Because remember, the larger chatzar is treated as if it's walled off from the smaller chatzar, and therefore I'm not in the same rishus as the excrement. So we'll say, Abai makes a fascinating observation. He says, Amrlu Abai, Imkain, Matzinu mechitza le'isser, Shilmole im mechitza machik dalaramas azoreya, Vilo hashta asura. So we'll say, let's go back for just a moment. The first case we brought, the first non-Eruvin case that we brought, was a case of Klai HaKerem. So remember the case of Klai HaKerem, we'll say, so we said that halacha l'maisa, in the situation of where you're planting the vines and the greens. So we'll say under normal circumstances, the halacha is, under normal circumstances, all you need to do is distance those two things, dal ramas. That's all you have to do, dal ramas. And Abai says, interestingly enough, in this case over here, where we have a mechitza, we have a partition, suddenly everything becomes so much more complicated. Right? They're both saying, remember again what the Gemara said, in a situation ultimately again where you have vines in the you have a vineyard in the larger chatzar, and ultimately again the Gemara says you're not allowed to go ahead and put greens in the smaller chatzar. Sabai says it's totally illogical. Here I have a mechitza, and yet halacha l'maisa, I'm not allowed to plant greens on the other side of the mechitza. Yet if I had no mechitza at all, all I would need to do is what? Dalet amis, and I'm good to go. If that's the case, Abaye says it turns out that sometimes a mechitza actually creates a situation of isser. That the presence of a mechitza actually creates complications more than no mechitza. Then I will say that sounds totally counterintuitive, because usually we assume that a mechitza just always helps. Yet Abaye is pointing out, at least over here by the case of Klaya Kerem, you see that mechitza actually makes things more complicated. To which the Gemara says, so Abizir says, Abaye, is that true? That we never find the case of mechitza that causes isser. So we'll say if you have a small chatzar that is totally breached, if you have a large chatzar that opens up into a small chatzar, so what's talach? We'll say this is our case we're dealing with. Remember, the small chatzar is totally open on one side. Large chatzar has the gifufin. So what's halacha? Gidola mutaris ketana asura. So ultimately, again, the larger chatzar is mutar, smaller chatzar is asur. Why? Mipnei shekepischa shel gidola. Because halacha l'maisa, the smaller chatzar is considered to be like the entranceway of the larger chatzar. And I will say, now watch this. Now this is because halacha l'maisa. Why? Because Rabbi say halacha l'maisa, the larger chatzar is considered to be enclosed. Why? We've seen this already. Why? Because even on the side where it's breached to the smaller chatzar, we view the partial partitions, what we call the gifufin, as enclosing it. But watch this. Vilu hishva as gifufeha. Rabbi say, what happens if you evened out the gifufin? So Rabbi say, this is picture. This is picture 330. You could look at 330. It's the same idea. So we'll say, imagine for a moment if you went ahead and, it's picture 328. Sorry about that. So we'll say, you can see this over here. So what did you do? So you started out with the gifufim, which are the partial walls, the partial pieces of the wall that extend on the side of the large chutzner where it opens up into the smaller chutzner. Imagine for a moment now, what did you do? You even out the walls. So you took the walls of the smaller chutzner and extended them all the way into the larger chutzner in this case. So we'll say, what happens in that situation? Hishvas gifufeha, gedolanami asura. We'll say, in that case, the larger chutzner also becomes asur. So we'll say, so here you see a case where you're making a new mechitza, and the creation of the new mechitza actually asers the larger chutzner. Amrle, that's not a good case. Hasam siluk mechitzasu. I will say that's a case of removal of mechitzas. Remember, in that case, what you've done is you've effectively removed the gifufin. Well, once you remove the gifufin, now both the smaller chutzner and larger chutzner are fully breached one into the other. The Gemara says, is that just to understand what we're trying to see over here is there what we're bothered by is, starting with the case of Klai HaKerem, I see a situation where halacha l'maisa, a mechitza, the presence of a wall, makes things, obviously a halachic wall, makes things more complicated. I always thought the presence of a mechitza makes things easier. So I'll say, for example, just very simply, we saw in the case of large chutzner, small chutzner, it's very complicated to have vines in the large chutzner and plant greens in, or I should say, right, and plant greens in the small chutzner. Ultimately, again, because that's the problem of klai hakerem, because the small chutzner is absorbed into the large chutzner, even though, technically speaking, there's a mechitza in between the large chutzner and the small chutzner. Yet, forget about chutzner. If I just had a big open field and I planted vines, all I need to do is distance myself 4 amos and plant greens. So the Gemara says, how could it be that the presence of a mechitza actually complicates things? So we're trying to bring up a case where you see that mechitzas sometimes can complicate things. Listen to this. So Rabbi said that by Velomazin mechitza l'isravaha itmar top of tzadik gimel sichecha gabi achsadra sheyesh la petzimin. So this is very interesting. If you went ahead and imagine for a moment you put schach on top of an achsadra particle that has petzimin. So Rabbi said these petzimin. So if you can imagine for a moment, here's what you have. You have a picture in Rashi, but it's also picture 329. So if you notice over here in your sukkah, you have 2 full walls, and then you have the petzimin. The petzimin are at all 4 corners over here. You have a board that is at least 1 tefach wide. The Rabbi said, I remember the halacha for sukkah is all you need is shtei defanas l'mashahu. all you need is 2 full walls, right? 2 full walls, and a third wall that is something. Even a tefach suffices. So you have over here, you have 2 full walls, and ultimately, again, a tefach board. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Sichech al gabi achsad sheish lo b'tzimin, shtei defano sheish lo kilchas lo arkav asui kimavoi, ubedofen shlishis urevius kavuin amudin lekarne hazavius sheish lam tefach. So what's that halacha? Say sukkshera. Such a sukkah is kosher because I've got 2 full walls and a third wall of a tefach. V'ilu hishva pitzimeha. Rabbi say if you were to even out the petzimin. So Rabbi say, what does that mean? So that's picture 330. So what you did over here is Rabbi say you took the petzimin and what did you do? You filled up, instead of having 4 posts like that, you filled up the entire interior with those type of walls. So Rabbi say if you go ahead and you do that, what happens? Halacha l'maisa, the sukkah is puzzle. Why is the sukkah puzzle? Because now it's only considered as if it has 2 walls. So we'll say here you see, what have you done? You've added onto the mechitza, and what does that do? That invalidates the sukkah. To which the Gemara says, no. Lididik sheira. So first of all, Abai suggests you should know. For me, such a sukkah actually is kosher. Such a sukkah is kosher. But however, according to you, lididach siluk mechitza. So Rabbi say you haven't introduced the mechitza. Instead, what have you done? You've removed the mechitza. Remember, the petzimin by themselves were a mechitza. By filling in that entire interior space, what you've done is you've removed a mechitza. Is that true that we don't find the case of mechitza le'isr? V'hatanya, we learn, listen to this case. So if you have a home, Rabbi say inside of the home, what happened? Part of the roof collapsed. So therefore you have we'll call it, you have half a roof left. So what's the halacha? Gifanim kan mutar lizra gifanim kan mutar lizra kan. So let's listen to this. So if, let's say, for example, you go ahead and you plant vines underneath the roof, you could plant wheat or whatever, greens on the other unroofed side, right? But yet if you go at, we're both saying now why, what's the logic? This is quite amazing. Because we'll say, what do we say? Pi tikra yorid v'sosin. We'll say we view the edge of the roof as extending downwards, and therefore halacha l'maisa, there's considered to be a mechitza in between the vines and the greens. Yet, v'lehishva eskiruya, but I will say if you were to go ahead and complete the roof, aser, then ultimately again it would be aser. So you see over here that the addition of the mechitza ultimately is problematic. Again, Amrlei, no, hasam silik mechitza su. But we'll say if you go ahead and you complete the roof, that's not introducing a mechitza. Rather, what is that doing? That is the removal of a mechitza. Because beforehand you had pitikar yard v'sosim, the side of the roof extends downwards and creates a partition. Now you are effectively removing that partition. Okay, shalchli Rav Abaye, biad Rav Shmaya bar Zira v'lo matzina mechitza le'iser. So I'll say again, we're just trying to figure out. So is this unique by Klaya Karen that we saw in the case on yesterday's daf, or do we find other cases where mechitza actually creates iser? V'hatanya yesh b'mechitza sakerem. Both say sometimes you could find by a mechitza in a vineyard, sometimes the presence of the mechitza could create the kula, sometimes a chumrah. How so? Ketzad kerem hanatua ad ikr mechitza. So I'll say this is actually a very interesting case. We've seen this before. So if you have a kerem, if you have a vineyard that is planted up until a partition, up until a wall. So I'll say what's the halacha? Zorea meikr mechitza ve'elech. You can go ahead and plant, ultimately, again, from the other side of the mechitza and on. I will say, so in other words, if you have a wall, if you have mamish mechitza, not imagine, an actual wall on one side, if you have a wall, on one side you could plant a vineyard, and on the other side you could plant whatever you want. Right? That's the halacha. No klayak care if there's mamish a wall in the window. Right? So again, one more time. If you have a vineyard that's planted up until an actual wall, you could plant whatever you want on the other side of that wall. Listen to this. Because we will say, if there's no mechitza there, marchik dalid amis vizorea. If there's no mechitza, all you need to do is distance the vines from the greens or the vines from the wheat, dalid amis, and then plant whatever you want. V'zeu mechitza sakaram lahakel. And I both say, this is a case of where mechitza in a vineyard creates a kula. So we'll say, what's the kula? If there's a wall, you could plant vines on one side and whatever you want on the other side. And again, we'll say that could be even if the wall is 4 tfachim thick. It doesn't make a difference. How thick or how thin. If there's a wall, that divides. If there's no wall, you need a minimum of dalet amas. So that is where a wall creates. I'm sorry? It's like these. What do you mean? I missed it. Say it once more.
Like these social distancing barriers. You need like a distance.
Right, correct. Right. Oh, good, right. Good aura. Right? It's like plexiglass social right barriers, right? You can be right next to each other if it's high enough, but otherwise you need social mamish. Yesh chachma b'pandemic. Good. So I'll say, so the Gemara says as follows. So therefore, again, so this is the kula. So just hold cup with this. So this is the kula. So the kula is if there's a mechitza, you can plant whatever you want on either side of the mechitza. However, lahachmir. So I will say, where sometimes does the presence of a mechitza of a wall create a chumrah? Lahachmir. Ketzad haya mashach mina kosel yud aleph amas. So I'll say, here we go. So if the vineyard was 14 amas away from the wall. First wide line, I will say. Lo yavi zera l'sham. So I will say you can't go ahead and plant anything. You can't. Zera means I will say whatever the other item is, greens or wheat. You can't bring any other seed there. She'omali in mechitza marchik dalet amas. Because ultimately, again, if there was no mechitza, you'd be marchik dalet amas vizorea, and ultimately, again, you'd be able to seed vizoy mechitza sakerem lahachmin. I will say this is the case of mechitza sakerem that ultimately again represents a chumrah. We'll see what that yud aleph amma is in just a moment. Amar le'letamech osvin mimas nisin. According to this logic, why don't you bring up the Mishnah? Here we go, Abba. So you're going to see what this yud aleph amma is. So here we go. Disnan karachas sakerem. So we'll say this is a fascinating case. Karachas sakerem literally means a bald spot in the vineyard. So I'll say, what's the pshat? So you can see, just if you want the imagery, this is picture 331. So I'll say, what you're looking at over here is, you begin to see a vineyard, and in the middle of the vineyard, you cleared out an area. So what I would like to do is, I would like to plant something else, mamish, in the middle of the vineyard. That's called karachas hakerem. So I'll say, how do you do that? How can you structure that? So the Gemara says, Beis Shammai omrim chav dalet amma. Beis Shammai says you need a minimum space of 24 amas. Ubeis Hillel omrim tez zayin amma. Beis Hillel say that you need ultimately again 16 amas. So we'll say what we're going to see is as follows. What we're going to see is the way that's essentially made up is that you need at least dalet amas of spell. Well, we'll see it. So the Gemara says so that's the case. So Beis Shammai says it has to be 24 amas of clearing. Ultimately, again, Beis Hillel says 16 amas of clearing. So we'll say if you take a look, all right, let's read a little bit more. So the Gemara says, Mechala kerem. We'll say, what about if you want to create a pathway around the vineyard? So the pathway around the vineyard, we'll say, that is picture 332. So in this case over here, in picture 331, that's called karachas hakerem. I want to go ahead and clear out a space in the middle of the vineyard and plant something else. 331. In 332, I want to plant something around the perimeter of the vineyard. Now, I will say, now remember on 332, there's two issues going on over here. 332, I want to plant around the vineyard, but there's also a wall around this entire field that's going to be incredibly important. So I will say, so you could see, I just want to point out 331 reflects the view of Beis Hillel, that picture. So you can see you have dalet amas on either side, because I will say you always need dalet amas around the area. The reason you need dalet amas is considered to be the work area. Right? You need an area around the perimeter of the vineyard, or for that matter, a perimeter around whatever you're planting, in order you could see for the wagon and the horses to go around. So we'll say what you're seeing in 331 is Shitas Beis Hillel. You've got 4 amas on either side and 8 amas of actual planting area. So that's Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai holds that ultimately, again, you need 24. So I'll say the 24 is the same idea. Essentially, again, it's the same 4 amas around the perimeter. It's just extra planting area that Beis Shammai says. Good. Mechala kerem. What about mechala kerem? What about if you want to plant around the perimeter of the vineyard? So Beis Shammai omrim tezayin amma. So Beis Shammai says you require 16 amas of space. Beis Hillel omrim yud beis amam. Beis Hillel says that you require only 12 amas of space. Ve'ezi karachas hakerem. So we'll say now that I define the terms to you, but now the Gemara defines them. What is this bald spot in the vineyard? Kerem shecharav em saiso. It's a kerem, it is a vineyard that you've just literally destroyed the middle. So what you've done is, for whatever the reason, you've removed the vines from the middle, made that area empty. Now you want to plant something else. If you don't have at least 16 amos, so we'll say this is the position of Beis Hillel. And remember again, what's the 16 amos? The 16 amos is 4 amos around the perimeter of whatever you're going to plant, and 8 amos of actual planting area. That's the measurements here. So if you don't have at least 16 amos, lo yavi zera l'sham. Then halacha l'maisa, you should not plant anything else there. Hayusham tazayin amo, but halacha l'maisa, if there is at least 16 amos of space, then what? No sin lo kedavodaso. Then Abba say you go ahead and you allocate 4 amos around the perimeter of that area. Ultimately, again, we'll call it as work area, cultivation area. Vizorea as hamosa. I think you could go ahead and plant the rest. Ezehi machala kerem. What's the case of the path around the vineyard? So the Gemara says beina kerem lagader. That refers ultimately again to the area between the wall and the vineyard. Shim'in sham yud beis amo. Because we'll say ultimately again, if there's not at least 12 amos, lo yavi zera l'sham, then you cannot go ahead and plant anything else there. However, hayasham yud beis amo, if there's at least 12 amos, then what? No sin lo kedavodaso vizoreas hamosar. So we'll say if there's 12 amos, then what can you do? Remember how this works. You're going to need 4 amos between, we'll call it the zera, the seed, and the wall. You're going to need another 4 amos in between the zera and the kerem, right? So 4 amos on either side. And halacha l'maaseh, that leaves you at least 4 amos for planting area. So according to Beis Hillel, that is the only way you could plant another species around a vineyard, in between a vineyard and a wall. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see here that the presence of the wall ultimately again creates complications. Ela hasam lav hainu time the chol dalet amos legabe kerem avodas hakerem legabe geder kevan delom is darin afkuri mafkerluhu de beni. I'm sorry, afkuri mafkerluhu. So let's listen to this. So the Gemara says, here's the difference. When it comes to a kerem, we'll say you have to allocate those dalet amos for the space to work around the kerem. Meaning that's a non-negotiable amount that has to be allocated, because without that you can't go ahead and work the area. So the Gemara says legabe geder, but by a wall, the distance between the wall and the dalet amos, kivan delom is darin, since that area cannot be planted, therefore afkuri mafkerluhu. So the Gemara says, the beni, which is the area between the dalet amos of the wall and dalet amos of the kerem, i'ika dalet chashvinon. If there's at least a space of dalet amos, then it's choshev. V'ilo, but ultimately again, if there's not a space of dalet amos, lo chashvinon, then ultimately again, it cannot be reckoned. So we'll say, so the Gemara essentially explains, the presence of the mechitza over here does not presence of the mechitza does not make the case more complicated. The presence of the mechitza, I will say, just creates a new mitzias. And because it creates a new mitzias, therefore, again, it drives all of these dimensions in these particular cases. Fine. I'm Rav Yehuda. Gimel karfifios. So you have 3 karfifs, I will say. Zeh b'tzad zeh. So we'll say another. So again, so just to understand, what the Gemara is pointing out over here is, yes, it is true that sometimes it would appear that the presence of a mechitza makes things more complicated. But lamaisa, it's not really the mechitza that makes things more complicated. Sometimes it's the new dynamics that are introduced that makes the case more complicated. A mechitza generally helps. Just sometimes you have other factors that come into play in these cases. Okay, so another case say this is, you're going to see we're bringing up this case now because of the gifufin. So Rav Yehuda, gimel karfifos zeh b'tzad zeh. Also, you have 3 karfifs, one next to the other. Ushnayim achitzonim migufafim. The 2 outer ones are migufafim v'amtzai and a megufaf. So we'll say this is picture 333. So we'll say in this case over here, what you have is you have 3 guys who are traveling. Each of them, and then they're in some large open area. They decide to go ahead and enclose their areas with these vertical poles, right, that are less than 3 tefachim from one another, thereby enclosing the area. Enclosing the area. So we'll say, remember again, so these are 3 karfefs, large enclosed areas. 3 people. As you can see over here, the 2 outer ones are larger than the middle one, and whereas the middle one is fully breached on 2 sides, right, to each of the other karfefs. The 2 exterior karfefs or karfifos are totally enclosed, right? They're fully enclosed on three sides, and even on the fourth side where they're partially breached, you have the gifufim, right? You have the partials that are there in order to make them as if they are enclosed. So watch this. So it says the Gemara, what's that? And I will say there is one person situated in each of these three karfefs. Naaseh kishayara. So I will say they are treated like a caravan. V'nostan lahen kol tzarchan, and you ultimately again allow that you give them as much space as they need. So I will say, let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Gimel karfifo zeh b'tzadzeh, kigon shayu mahalchin b'derech. So I will say the case over is three guys are traveling together. Ve'kifo Gimel karfifos ledira b'mechitza shel shasi, kigon shel konim o shel arv, kigon chavalim, shleitir b'l yachid ela beis sasaim. So I will say, so first of all, understand if you're using, or let's say if you are enclosing an area with either vertical or horizontal poles or ropes, but just one of those, then halacha l'maisa you have a maximum area of 2 beisa. We've seen this before. 2 beisa that you could enclose. So what happens? We'll say ultimately again, an individual cannot enclose an area that is more than 2 beisa, unless of course he makes a mechitza that is shasi va'arev, vertical and horizontal poles or ropes. So let's read the next Rashi. So that's the case. 3 guys traveling with each other. They enclosed their 3 karfefs with vertical poles. So what happens? Shnai machitzonim megufafin, shachitzonim rechavim min ha'amtzai, v'hu paris l'shneim b'milo, b'gifufin otfin alav. So one more Rashi. V'yachid bazeh, v'yachid bazeh, v'yachid bazeh, nasu shiara v'nosen katzarachan. Da'amrin on diore gidolim b'katan, v'nimtzu shloshem emtzai, emtzai mitzarfan, mutar emtzai zeh, kol shu gadol hekef, v'mechitza sheh. Supposed to listen to this. So what's the case? So now what we view in this case, I will say, is that we view them, all 3 of them, diure gidolim b'katan. We view ultimately, again, all 3 of them as if they're all situated in the middle karfef. Why is it, Abu say? Because we view the middle karfef as an entranceway, as an opening, ultimately again to the two larger side karfefs. So therefore, because ultimately again they're all situated technically, halachically, in the middle karfef, therefore halacha l'maisa, they are considered to be a shayara. They are considered to be a caravan. Then I will say ultimately again, once they are considered to be a caravan, then halacha l'maisa, they are permitted to use, all of them are permitted to use this entire enclosed area. Now Rashi points out over here, it must also be that they joined in a common eruv together. So we'll say, this is just using a little bit of a different application of this idea. In this idea, everything is opening up into the middle karfef. The fact that the middle karfef is considered to be an entranceway, so to speak, for both the 2 larger karfefs, we view it as if all 3 individuals are situated in one area, and therefore they become a shayara. They become a caravan, and therefore they are granted all of them are granted the entire enclosed area. Conversely, the Gemara says, listen to this. Fine. So the Gemara says, okay, I'm sorry. Good. I'll say what happens if the inner karfef is magufaf and the 2 outer ones are not. So we'll say this is picture 334. So if it's just the reverse case. So we'll say, imagine for a moment the middle karfef is the largest one, and therefore it's magufaf, and the 2 outer ones are not magufaf. So what happens in this particular case? The Gemara says, so what's the halacha? V'yachid bazeh, v'yachid bazeh, v'yachid bazeh. And there's one individual in each of the karfef. So what's the halacha? Einos lahen ela beis shish. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, you give them each of them are given. Look at Rashi. Einos lahem ela, einos lahem, Rashi says, ela beis sasaim l'chol karfef, shahari ein shlosha diurim be'echad diure emtzai b'chitzon. So listen to this. In this case, you don't view each of them as being situated, all of them as being situated in one karfef, and therefore halacha l'maisa, all each of them really receive are their own respective areas. Fine. Ibay lehum. Suppose say only bringing that up because that's another case of gifufin. Fine. Ibay lehu. Echad bazeh ve'echad bazeh u'shnayim b'shnayim be'emtzai ma'u. Suppose say what happens if you have one person in each of the outer karfefs and 2 people in the inner karfef? What happens there? Mahu. Ilahacha nafki tlasahavu v'ilahacha nafki tlasahavu. So we'll say, do we say that technically speaking, the 2 guys in the middle, whichever karfef they go to, that will effectively create a karfeif of 3 people, which is a share caravan. Or do we halachically view it as perhaps again the 2 people in the middle, one will go to one karfeif, one will go to the other karfeif. And I will say, if you say that we view that out of the 2 of them, each of them will go in a different direction. If you have 2 people in each of the other outer karfeifs, and one person in the middle karfeif, what's the halacha? So do we say that in this case, whichever way the guy goes, there'll automatically be 3 people in one karfeif, which makes it a shayara? Or do we say, no, since we don't know where he's going to go, it's impossible to assign his interest to either one of the karfeifs. So therefore, I will say the halacha is v'hilchasa bayan l'kula. We'll say in all of these cases, we go ahead and we rule l'kula, which I will say essentially means that whenever you have the ability to view it as 3 people residing in one joint area, we treat them as a shayara. So we'll say, without getting into all the technicalities of karfeif, although we saw this in Masechah Shabbos already, we'll say whenever you have 3 people and they're considered to be like a caravan is given many more rights in terms of usage of the area and could also have the ability to enclose a much larger area. So whenever we have the ability to view all 3 people in one particular area, we rule l'kula and view them as residing in one area. Good. Amr Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said his house. We'll say another case. Gidud Amud Beis. Gidud chamisha umechitza chamisha. So what about the following case? Let's say you have, we'll say Gidud means you have an embankment of 5 amas or 5 tfachim, and the mechitza 5 tfachim. So we'll say, so this is picture 335. So that's a pretty straightforward picture. So you could see over here, you have a bottom embankment. So you just have earth. So we'll say in this case over here, this is showing Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say what you have essentially is Rosh Hashanah is higher. Again, it doesn't really matter what's on either side, as they're going to see. But the idea is one area is higher than the other. So you have 5 tefachim of just natural embankment. And then on top of that, you build a mechitza of 5 tefachim. So I have a wall of 10 tefachim. Just it's not all wall. It's 5 tefachim embankment, 5 tefachim wall. Ein mitztarfin achu o kulo gidor begidor o kulo b'mechitza. Wow. Suppose say the Gemara says doesn't work. In order to be a mechitza of 10 tefachim, you have to be all embankment or all wall. Got to choose a team. So the Gemara says, Meisve, is that true? Shtei chatzeros ulam. We'll say if you have 2 chatzeros, right, chatzer A, chatzer B, and let's say chatzer A is higher, it's at a higher elevation, then chatzer B. The Gemara says ve'al yona gavoa min hatachtona sar tfachim. And what happens? The upper chatzer is more than 10 tfachim higher than the lower chatzer. Oh, yesh ba gidud chamisha mechitza chamisha. Or I will say what happens? Let's say the actual the higher chatzer A, is 5 tefachim higher than Chatzer B, and you build a wall of 5 tefachim on top of the 5 tefach embankment. So I will say this is picture 336, right? So remember again, the further Chatzer is Chatzer A, the closer Chatzer is B. So remember again, Chatzer A is 5, naturally Chatzer A is 5 tefachim higher. I put a wall of 5 tefachim on top of that 5 tefach embankment. So what's the halacha, I will say? So the Gemara says, Ma'arvin shnai ve'ei ma'arvin echad. The halacha is, Chatzer A and Chatzer B can't make a joint Eruv. They can't make a joint. We'll say, why can't they make a joint Eruv? Why not? Because they are separated by a wall of 10 tefachim or more. And we'll say, remember again, we saw this goes back a while. Right? The halacha l'maaseh, if you have 2 chatzeros that are separated by a wall of 10 tefachim or more, they cannot enter into a joint Eruv. The Yoras Pachos Mikan, but if the wall is less than 10 tefachim, ma'arvin echad ve'im ma'arvin shnaim, then halacha l'maaseh, they could only make 1 Eruv and they can't make 2 Eruvim. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that a mechitza that is partial embankment, partial wall, works. It does work. So again, we'll say this here. We said before that a wall that's partial embankment, partial wall doesn't work. Here we see that it does work. So the Gemara says, Amarav, Mod Rav Chisda betachtona, hoyel veroa pnei asara. So we'll say, so Rav Chisda will say you're right. When do we say that it's a wall? See, in this case, it's different. Because in this case, the lower chatzer, when the lower chatzer, I will say, looks towards, right, when we call it chatzer B, looks towards chatzer A, what does chatzer B see? It sees a wall of 10 tefachim. Lamaisa, there's a wall of 10 tfachim. So because there's a wall of 10 tfachim, therefore it works as a mechitza. Ihachi. If that's the case, tachtona te'arev shnayim, v'lo se'arev echad. So we'll say, so now I understand why the lower chutzner cannot join in an eruv with the upper chutzner, because the lower chutzner has a mechitza that's 10 tfachim, so it can only make its own eruv, can't make a joint eruv. El Yona, but we'll say, what about the upper chutzner? Lo se'arev lo echad v'lo shnayim. So we'll say, I should say that lemaisa, the upper chutzner, really should be stuck. Right, so we'll say, why is the upper chutzner stuck? Listen to this, very interesting. Why is the upper chutzner, right, the higher chutzner, when I say upper chutzner, chutzner A, why is chutzner A stuck? We'll say, watch this. Could it join in an eruv with chutzner B? Could chutzner A join an eruv with chutzner B? No, why not? Why not? We'll say, again, sorry, let me just clarify, I'm getting a little blank expressions here. We'll say, let me clarify this case. Remember again, two chatzeros. Chatzar A is the chatzar at a higher elevation. Chatzar B is the chatzar at a lower elevation. So chatzar A is a 5 tefach elevation over chatzar B. What we then do is we put a 5 tefach wall on top of the 5 tefach elevation. So now so the Gemara says that's a 10 tefach wall. They can't make a joint eruv. They could each make their respective eruvim. So the Gemara says, I don't understand that. I understand why chatzar B, which is the lower chatzar, cannot join in an eruv with chatzar A. Why not? Why not? There's a mechitza. There's a 10 tefach wall that's separating it from chatzar A. But Rabbosai, chatzar A seems to be stuck a little bit. Why? Chatzar A can't join in a common eruv with chatzar B. Why not? Because chatzar B has that 10 tefach wall. But yet chatzar A should also not be able to make its own eruv. Why not? Because lamaisa, it opens up into chatzar B and only really has a 5 tefach wall. Because once remember again, chatzar A is the chatzar at the elevation. So really all it has is a 5 tefach wall, which means technically on a halachic level, it is breached into chatzar B. If that's the case that it's breached into chatzar B, you really should not be able to make an eruv at all in chatzar A. So that's what it means. The Gemara says, "Ihachi tachtonati arev shnayim." So I understand ultimately again why the lower chatzar B, can make its own eruv, because chatzar B is walled off from chatzar A with a bona fide 10 tefach wall. However, again, El Yona, what we call the upper chatzar A, the higher chatzar, the chatzar at the elevation. Let's remember again, from chatzar A's perspective, when you're in chatzar A, what's the only thing you see? What's the only thing you see? A 5 tefach wall. That's all you see. That's the only partition you have. If that's the case, lo se'arev lo echad v'lo shnayim. The Rabbi say the truth is chatzar A is stuck. It obviously can't join in an eruv with chatzar B, but really it shouldn't be able to make its own eruv either. Amar Rabbi Bar Ula ki gon shaysal yona migufefes ad eser amos. Oh, Rabbi say, so what's the case here? Very interesting. The case of here, Rabbi say, is where the chatzar al yona is migufefes, that you have partials. You have partials, right? You have partial partition there until you walls off an area up until an opening of 10 amos. So both say, if you want to see the picture, so this is picture 337. So both say, what ends up happening over is something very interesting. So in this case over here, chatzar A actually has partial walls on its border with chatzar B. So that partial wall doesn't go all the way. It closes up to an area of less than 10 amos. Therefore, that's viewed as an entrance. So if I was to essentially what the Gemara answers is, in this case, chatzar A also has a mechitza of 10 tfachim from its side. It just doesn't go the whole way. So as long as the opening is less than 10 amos, then halacha l'maisa that's reckoned as an entranceway. Therefore, chatzar A also has a mechitza of 10 tfachim, and that's why chatzar A can't join in an eruv with chatzar B as well, but does have the ability to make its own eruv. Very interesting. Ihachi, if that's the case, ema safe. What about the end of the brayso that says, palchos mikan ma'arvin echad ve'em ma'arvin shnayim? Less than this amount, the halacha is that ultimately, again, they can make one joint there. And I was supposed to say less than this amount, but pashtus means that what? That halacha l'maisa, if it's less than 10 tefachim high, they can make one eruv, but they can't make two eruvim. Ibaya chad, so the Gemara says, Ibaya chad ti'arev, Ibaya tre ti'arev. So if that's the case, I will say, then really in this case, if it's talking about that it's migufafin on chatzar A side, then halacha l'maisa, they should still have the right to make one eruv, to make two eruvim. Amarabri dravar kingon shenifritza tachtona b'milua le'elyona. Both say the case that we're dealing with over here in the Seifa is where the lower chatzar was fully breached into the upper chatzar. So both say this is picture 338. So I'll say in this case over here, it's 338, so you can see a lot of stuff going on over here. So you have the mechitza itself, which is partial embankment, partial wall. But then I'll say what you also have over here is the smaller chutzner, or we'll call the lower chutzner, is fully open on one side, whereas the larger or the upper chutzner ultimately again has the gifufin. To which the Gemara says, "Ihaki tachtona chad te'arev trelo te'arev." If that's the case, the lower chutzner ultimately again should be able to make its own eruv, but should not be able to join in an eruv with the higher chutzner, because after all, there is a mechitza of 10 tefachim. Elyona, but ultimately again the higher chutzner, ibaya trei te'arev, if it wants to go ahead and make its own eruv, it should be able to do so. Ibaya chad te'arev. But because the smaller chutzner, the lower chutzner, is fully breached into the higher chutzner, should be able to make a joint eruv as well. To which the Gemara says, "You're right." Enachinami v'chi katani pachos mikan v'chi katani pachos mikan ma'arvin echa ve'ema arvin shnayim atachtona. And enachinami, the Gemara says, "You're right." When it says pachos mikan, that if it's less than 10 tefachim, ultimately again they can make one eruv, but they can't make two eruvim. That refers to the lower chutzner, not to the higher chutzner. Good. So I'll say Darsh Meremar, Gidud Chamisha Mechitza Chamisha Mitztarfin. So I'll say Meremar Darshan that if you have an embankment of 5 tefachim with a mechitza of 5 tefachim, they can go ahead and combine to form a wall of 10 tefachim. So I'll say this is the embankment idea, that a mechitza need not be 10 tefachim of all wall, 5 tefachim of embankment, 5 tefachim of wall absolutely work. So Ashkechi Ravina Rabach Rabbi Rava Amar Leitani Marmidi b'mechitza. So listen to this. Ravina found Rav Acha Brei Rava, and he said, "Tell me, did you learn anything in yeshiva about this type of mechitza? What is the status of a mechitza that is 5 tefachim embankment, 5 tefachim?" I will say, by the way, when we say 5 and 5, that ratio is actually irrelevant. The shaila is, can you make a joint mechitza from essentially a natural geographic partition with some wall added on? I understand that a full mechitza could work, and I also understand that a full embankment could work. That I know, but the shaila just is about like, could a mechitza embankment combination work? Amar Leilo, so Ravina said, so I'm sorry. Rav said we didn't know anything about it in the yeshiva. V'hilchasa, Rav say what's the halacha? Gidud chamisha mechitza chamisha mitzarfin. Rav say the halacha is that halacha lamaisa again, if you have an embankment of 5 tefachim and ultimately again a wall of 5 tefachim, that ultimately those two together do work to make a complete wall of 10 tefachim. Ultimately, again, for Eruvin purposes. By Rav Osha, we'll say just another few lines. By Rav Osha, Tirun Abba B'Shabbos Maro. So we'll say an interesting case that comes. We'll say that is a piece of halacha l'maisa. Okay, so one takeaway. Ultimately, again, so a mechitza, 5 tefachim of embankment, 5 tefachim of wall, or any combination of the two is a bona fide mechitza for Eruvin purposes. Good. So we'll say asks the Gemara. Well, at least we'll mention the shah, then we'll stop. By Rav Osha, Tirun Habban B'Shabbos Mahu Sheyasu. So we'll say what is the halacha? With, again, literally, what it literally means is residents who come on Shabbos, do they aser? Now we'll say, now what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. It's Rashi right across. You're in Abbanim b'Shabbos. Kigon kosel shebein shtei chatzeros shenafal b'Shabbos. Do you rayu hashtag yadad? Let's listen to this case. This is supposed to say where you have let's say two chatzeros. Each chatzer made its own respective eruv. We'll say then what happened? Shabbos comes. So again, everything is fine. Shabbos, 2 hours after candle lighting, what happens? The wall comes down. So we'll say suddenly, again, what do we have? One big, happy Chatzar family. There's only one problem. What does this do to our Eruv? So does the introducing new residents into the Chatzar on Shabbos, does that answer the Eruv or not? Some Rav Chisda, Tashma, Chatzar, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with this by Rav Oshia, Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shkach, we'll say.